Key consideration. The first argument is that language shapes reality. It actually allows us to understand, allows us to interrogate the relationship that we have with what's actually happening inside the world. And the second argument is that the status quo discourse must be questioned. Out of breath. Observation 2, domestic nuclear policy. The aim point of the focus on nuclear weapons as the key point of nuclear policy obscures the means of production are arguments that allows us to ignore things like the mining, disposable, and the testing that actually happens. Arguments that testing is specifically a key aspect in this debate round. The key point of the debates about nuclear fissile material systemically exclude the concerns of indigenous people. Arguments that the CTBT debates are specifically address concerns about the maintenance, but continues to exclude the voice of the indigenous people. And Senate continues to focus on extinction scenarios and apocalyptic nuclear wars instead of actually analyzing the nuclear war that continues on a daily basis on indigenous land. The sequence of disconnected scientific observers divide the world into pieces, refusing to recognize indigenous perspectives of interconnectivity. Our argument is that nuclear colonialism is still real because the testing that currently happens allows for nuclear traces. And instead they try to make arguments that subcritical nuclear testing doesn't actually make any change because it happens underground. They ignore the fact that the water basins inside of Nevada actually allow that to happen. Radiation escapes out whenever they start doing things like subcritical nuclear testing and pin testing. Deep what is the test on indigenous? Is the testing on indigenous land has never ended? It's just simply changed. The first argument is that subcritical nuclear testing is specifically keeping as a continuation of the legacy of the United States nuclear testing just by changing the way that it's labeled and the type of thing happening. Arguments is specifically in fact it's showing native land for over 50 years. Arguments even specifically with the Pollux test in 2012 that violated the 1863 Treaty of Ruby Valley. The second argument is specifically with subcritical nuclear testing that undermines the sovereignty of indigenous people because it will continue to destroy the treaties that are based on peace and friendship. There's not a single treaty that happened, a single treaty coming from indigenous land that has not been breached yet. Argument is that this just allows for constant irradiation of these individuals. The point is that subcritical nuclear tests are justified by the stockpile stewardship. Our first argument is that the United States predetermines that nuclear weapons are something that should be cared for and sustained without getting any analysis on why, other than they want the bomb for our children. The second argument is this ultimately places officials as the safeguard, saying that they're key to actually being the only ones that are able to protect them because they assume that it's something that we actually need without giving any more why. The observation 3 is the impacts. The 8 point is that framing controls what population the United States can actually commit violence against. Our argument is whenever they frame underneath the guise of stockpile stewardship, that argues that they allow us to make decisions about which lands we can actually test on and which individuals we can destroy. Our argument is this is the root cause of violence because it allows us to pinpoint one specific culture and identify it as the other, leading to a form of cultural genocide. The B point is that the focus on apocalyptic nuclear war united ignores the reality of the nuclear war that's happening every single day inside of indigenous land in the global south overall, because the United States allows this war to happen, but it continues to call it testing instead of realizing that this is just another form of war. The C point is that you have a moral obligation to fight government-sponsored cultural genocide. We're specifically pinpointing the indigenous people as the people that are allowed to kill, to have radiation flood inside of their water, and to literally just allow them all to die. The D point is that the logic of terminal nuclear impacts is an example of how the nuclear status quo continues to legitimize itself because it continues to say that they have to have these weapons, otherwise we're all going to die. But these are literally just lies that are made to try and convince you that this should happen. Thus, we affirm the United States federal government should prohibit subcritical nuclear testing. The United States federal government should prohibit subcritical nuclear testing. Any questions? No. Observations 4, solvency. The 8 point is that the 8 point argument is that we are creating a counter-hegemonic discourse, and we argue that that is specifically key. Our argument is that whenever we're discussing subcritical nuclear testing is key to address the problems of the status quo. The first point here is because whenever we ban this, it creates a signal of a shift in United States policy that allows us to imagine what the world will look like whenever we actually start to modify the changes that happens. Our argument is that this type of imagination allows us to understand and interrogate our relationship with subcritical nuclear testing now, and allows us to realize the form of ignoring that's been happening from the population against the type of war that happens on indigenous land on a daily basis. The second argument is that the case is not the end but only the beginning. Our argument is that we have to continue breaking open lines to allow us to understand that this is happening. Our argument is that once we can create discussion the farther that we can allow it to expand, it means that we can actually shift that relationship. The third argument is that whenever we eliminate this form of testing, it means that we will ultimately eliminate all forms of testing, which means that this thought project in particular is key because it allows us to understand what it means whenever we start to step away from the testing. The B point is that our discourse is specifically key. The first argument is it is an example of embodied solidarity with the indigenous population, showing that we need to understand what's happening to these individuals, become educated on the type of violence that occurs on them, and allow us to stand in solidarity with them and try and make some form of momentum to make changes. The second argument is that academic contribution is specifically key for 3 reasons. We argue it leads us to discovery, which means that we can expand the way that we understand on what's happening to the indigenous people. It also allows us to increase the amount of education that's happening, which means that we can also expand this knowledge to other individuals inside of the debate community. And it also means that we can create a form of advocacy This form of advocacy means that we can actually make motions to try and challenge the state and try and make action to change what is actually occurring inside of the world. The third argument is that only discourse can be able to solve because fiat is just an imaginary game that's created inside of debate. There's no way that we're going to actually make any type of change inside of the illusion of debate because that's creating any type of political change. And the fourth argument is that it opens up a political base, which means that as we continue to grow the community through educational and advocacy positions, it means that we can grow the community. Next is theory. A is the interpretation is the negative only gets one unconditional advocacy or the status quo. B points to standards. The first argument is that we have no backside rebuttals, which means that we have no way to actually analyze the type of theory that occurs today. The second argument is argument consistency. This means they can argue bidirectionally, which means that the MG has no way to actually predict what's going to happen. It means that if Beta only chooses to go one direction, they just kick out of one and choose the other. The third argument is that negative researchability. Argument is that the MG is not able to predict what the negative can do because the negative can run multiple forms in-depth advocacies. The fourth argument is it incentivizes blended debating because it means that they have to literally run twice as many positions, which means they're not getting any warranted analysis on why they're running these positions. The sequence that this is a voting issue. Arguments that kind of conditionality is bad in parliamentary debate and they run it, you automatically build them down. The first argument is that is because of in-round competition and competitive equity because it allows us to go to the furthest depth of one side of argumentation instead of trying to argue bidirectionally, not being able to understand what positions are happening. The second argument is that conditionality in parliament creates a negative structural bias because our argument is this ultimately lead to the collapse of parliamentary debate because nobody wants to play a rigged game. Argument is that the collapse of parliamentary debate is an impact outweighs any of their generic conditionality good arguments if they run it. And the third argument is that conditionality will link to our criticism. Our argument is that throughout history, the United States has treated all treaties as conditional because they continue to make them, and it was specifically to the treaties of 1863, and they've broken every single one. So if they decide to run any conditional policies, this means that they are literally upholding the exact same form of logic as the United States federal government. Ugh. Yeah, it's just, like, I'm having a hard time pulling air. Right. Yeah, I'm fine.
The altitude.
Wait, take a second. I'm good now. Yeah, I'm having a hard time getting air in. I don't know why.
We're going to do one off in case. Two off in case, sorry.
You want each one on one tab?
Yeah. Sure.
It's going to be first out of the teams.
Pardon? No.
Surprise! Yay.
Non-politics.
Non-politics.
You guys ready? All right. First is the interpretation. Evaluate the debate as a dialectical material. See where a historian inquiring into the determined factors of the PMC. The first argument is going to be that the particular facts are irrelevant without a totalizing historical theory. Focus on method is key to action, otherwise ideology constraints. Implementation. The second argument is going to be the Marxist methods are necessary to move discussion outside the state, which is capitalist locate discussion in the state, particularly to destroy class consciousness, which only made discussion outside the state avoids. The third argument is going to be that debate is a critical side of resistance. The way that we frame the impact of capitalism on us determines its true effects and the way that we evaluate those effects. The second argument is going to be that it's the method man. Marxist labor theory values the best way to evaluate historical theories. The first argument is going to be primacy. The affirmative overlooks prior causes. The class determines life literally from the moment one exits the womb. The ability of your parents and the people around you to have capital is what determines the way that you train yourself in your life. The second argument is going to be that it's totalizing. Theory is the most productive. It allows for the inclusion of coalition building. The particularisms cause internal dissent, which means that's a disadd to the permutation. The third argument is going to be ideology. Capitalism poses epistemic blind spots, which bankrupt their decision making. Their impacts are propaganda that should be ignored because the capitalist system will perpetuate whatever impacts regardless of that, regardless of what they attempt to solve for. Next is the link argument. The first argument is that utilizing weapons. The first argument is going to be that discursive framing is backwards. Ideology patterns are determined by material inequalities. Discourse theory sees the political by reducing radical action to transgressive speech acts. Certain discourses are assumed to be more significant than the labor relations that must be entered into, which ignores that they must first sell themselves on a daily basis to the capitalist system before they acquire the cultural markers of identity. That means that peoples are workers first, wage workers first, before they have the ability to ever accumulate an identity. The next argument is going to be the impact. The eighth one of this is that discursive theory is capitalist ideology. It is an emphasis on semiotic consumption, which only takes in resources rather than trying to address causes of problems. Next, the impacts page. The first argument is going to be the capitalism fuels in and the imperial drive to secure new sources of expansion. This organizing principle of the planet necessitates structural crisis and massive war fighting that culminates in extinction. The second argument is going to be the capitalist destructive logic will exceed material and social spheres. The A argument is that eco limits. Capital exhausts itself through climate change, which means that it lowers your carrying capacity and it will also have significant ramifications on the agricultural sector. Yeah, what's the question?
Why are you ignoring our movement? Do you not find us important?
Our argument is that your movement does not address the cause of the problem. Your movement merely masks the capitalist system, and the capitalist system will do it anyway. Second argument is going to be expansion. No new markets for expansion of capitalism, and it will then devour itself in the process to the point where they no longer have markets to expand into. Then they'll only use a percentage of the labor force, which means that the rest of the labor force will be pushed out and severely impoverished. The C point is going to be ideology. Capitalism fails to solve universally, which means that collapse is inevitable and only delayed by the affirmative, because capitalist ideology is always going to be problematic. That means that regardless of the affirmative action, capitalism will collapse. The third argument is going to be that determinism of capitalism is responsible for the instrumentalization of all life. This logic mobilizes and allows for the PMC scenarios. The root cause of why we view native populations as disposable is because they have a very low value to us monetarily. That is the awful nature of the capitalist system, is that it attaches this monetary value. The fourth argument is going to be that Turing's case, the ruling class is well aware of the PMC impacts. It's because capitalism places a lot of emphasis on short-term gains and will recklessly continue its own interests. The impacts are why we need to challenge the system, not why we need to continue to work within the system itself. The alternative: vote negative to endorse Marxist labor theory of value. Vote negative to endorse Marxist labor theory of value.
Can I get a copy of the alternative, please?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
I'll repeat it
Well,
again. Vote negative to endorse Marxist labor theory of value.
No, I need a permutation, something I can phrase a permutation.
Okay, James, right.
I need a copy of it.
First argument is going to be that revolutionary theory is a prior question. The affirmative is irrelevant in the grand scheme of capitalism. The 8 point is without revolutionary theory there can be no movement. Activating a revolutionary stance through the resolution as interrogation of class is valuable. The second argument is going to be the voting negative acts upon the ethical necessity of criticism by bringing violent practices to the fore. The next argument is going to be that condemnation is key. The affirmative politics of positive act and disavow critical relations of power. The B point is that the ethical act of condemnation calls class hierarchy into question and disrupts the system. The third argument is going to be that academia is the last bastion. Debate is absolutely critical because this round allows us to reevaluate the way that we take a stance towards capitalism. The fourth argument is that all perms are going to fail. First argument is going to be any permutation will be separate. Their epistemological stance operated within the system from the beginning. They cannot try to move away from the system in which they're operating. The B point is going to be regeneration. Any reinstantiation of capitalism is always going to cause it to spin back up. Capitalism is an inertial and vestigial machine, which means that anything left within the machine is going to spin back up. That means we need complete and utter rejection. Otherwise, the dominant ideology that's been occurring for the past years will simply respark. Yeah.
How does the PMC operate inside the system?
Because of the links, we argue that your focus on discourse is a form of capitalism.
Yeah, we say that you're discourse in itself.
Capitalist because we talk.
You are a capitalist because you
Your
ignore-
framing arguments and solving the arguments rely on modern capitalism as part of link arguments.
All right. You say that discourse must be questions. We articulate that the discourse of the status quo is a product of capitalist power relations. Your discourse that you're questioning is irrelevant in the scheme of capitalism because the system in itself will do whatever regardless. Your discourse of criticism is irrelevant at the point where the system can spin itself back up. Your movement through discourse is really just a way to mask the fact that you are unwilling to address the structural problems of the capitalist system in and of itself. You make the argument that this refusal to recognize the indigenous perspectives is problematic, but subcritical nuclear testing is the least harmful method, which probably means that you can turn this back, because when you try to take an action towards subcritical nuclear testing, that probably means that we no longer focus on the other forms of bad things that we do to natives. Furthermore, you do not address the actual problem of why we discriminate against natives. You articulate one specific method and then try to solve that. We articulate that that is far more problematic than trying to solve by reshaping the way that we view them first and then not doing bad things to them in the future. Then the next argument is going to be that you say that specific subcritical testing undermines sovereignty. The first argument is going to be that you mask it because you don't address any other form of nuclear waste, and even then you only focus it on nuclear waste. You do not focus it on any other methods that we use to oppress them. Yeah.
Is capitalism the reason why we treat indigenous folks the way we do?
Yes.
Okay.
Classes.
Classes, yeah. We articulate that we separate them into classes, and that then allows for discrimination. On your impact argument, you say that training controls the violence of population. We articulate that the first way that we pinpoint cultures is through class. The way that we articulate cultures within our society is by separating them based on the value that they provide to the system. Then you say that we just call it testing. The first argument is going to be that testing is, the next argument is going to be that there's no moral obligation in a world of bad ideology. If you're operating on a bad ideological stance, then you probably do not have the ability to make moral reasoning through that ideological stance. The next argument is going to be that there's no continuing hegemonic discourse because it ignores more harmful methods. The point where you're only challenging the discourse of the state, not actually the actions of the state. You are unable to solve for the bad implications of the state because we articulate that it'll have regardless. The next argument, you say that the ban is shaping U.S. policy. First argument is going to be that you don't actually ban it. You just say you affirm the resolution. There's no indication that you're actually banning some critical nuclear testing. And the next argument is that it's not the beginning, it's the end of the...
Plenty of questions.
Yeah, you've got plenty of questions. You say that you're standing in solidarity. The first argument is going to be that we still dump stuff on them anyway. We can't address the other aspects of your plan. And when it looks like we only take one thing away from this group, and we look like we're solving for one issue, there's no guarantee that that'll spiral into other issues. It just looks like it is masking the problem. Then you say that only discourse matters, but you are ignoring the production and the way that discourse in and of itself is produced. Then the second off. A, the interpretation of the affirmative should defend the implementation of a topical plan text because the violation they have no topical plan text. C is doing the stance versus predictability of resolution asks the question of state action, but they only answer the question of whether harms exist and how we talk about them. By not using the framework implied by the resolution, they destroy predictability since there are infinite alternative frameworks. Next time is going to be ground wheels and implementation dissads and counterplay grounds since they garner all their solvency through discourse. Next, the voters. First one's going to be education. We can't play the game unless we gain education out of it, and that's critical to get funding. Next time is going to be fairness, absolutely critical for fairness, because without fairness in debate, everyone goes 3-3 in tournaments and doesn't break, which is really awful. This is an a priori voting issue.
Alright, in true SIU form, I'm going to make your critique order a little confusing. But be sure to signpost these. I'm going to start with the link arguments. It's going to go the alternative arguments. Then I'll go framework and impacts. And I'll be sure to signpost between what I have as the link pages.
Can you do that one more time?
Yeah. Link page, alternative, framework, impacts. Their fiat arguments. Their fiat framework, the last one. And then I guess, did you all flow their case arguments on each individual sheet or just as one uniform dump?
I just kept flowing things down, straight down unless it's signposted.
Okay, well then I'll go in the same.
Yeah. Straight down would be fine.
Yeah, I'll just do that. All right, is anybody not ready?
So it's the critique and then the theory position and then the case?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody not ready? Linkers, the first argument that can ultimately solve the arguments that we see independently is the reason or why we treat individuals as different class individuals, because we see indigenous individuals as inferior because they do not fit into our bourgeoisie notion of what we see the economy as being. The second argument turn arguments that language is how we come to know these issues can ultimately cause by those arguments for framework means that the affirmative is a prior question towards the interrogation of the alternative. The third argument that turn we ultimately expose the mask arguments that a world in which we allow for the ability to interrogate these sort of economic issues. Why? I.e. we treat these individuals as inferior is largely as a result of the economic issues, which is indicated by the LC. That's probably the reason is why the affirmative is theoretically and methodologically consistent with the criticism of fourth argument's turn. Critical epistemology is absolutely essential arguments in a way in which the affirmative engages in the world allows for us to interrogate these sort of issues in the future. It means that the alternative, or that the affirmative is a breaking point that allows for the interrogation of the alternative law within the future. But the fifth argument's turn, we have to use the system to critique the system argument that we have to start by thinking that capitalism or class consciousness is not necessarily an issue in a way in which we can reform those discussions in the future. It means that if their link arguments are true, then that is the reason why that is the only way you can change the system in the future. Two subpoints. The eighth point is scholarship arguments. The world in which we do not engage in the system means that scholars and peer review would ultimately laugh us out of the room. But the B point is adequacy arguments that a world in which we do not engage in these systems as a prior question means that we are less likely to actually have the ability to change real politics because we would otherwise be co-opted. The fifth or the sixth argument's turn are arguments that links to information are ultimately bad, i.e. the fact that we do not talk about class consciousness. What their link is predicated upon is probably a pretty bad way of looking at the world. It means that there are hundreds of ways in which they could ultimately link to capitalism being bad as well. But the seventh argument's turn the affirmative exposes the intersectionality of these sort of issues, i.e. the fact that we see it as an intersection between race and class means that we can further interrogate what it means to be an individual within poverty or be an individual who is in a lower social or economic class means that that is the only way we can actually interrogate these sort of issues in the future. The alternative would be far worse because we would continue to see individuals, or because we would continue racist sort of ideologies in the future. But the eighth argument is third. If class is the reason is why we treat them as bad, or treat indigenous individuals as bad, that is probably a reason why the affirmative link turns the position, because we are taking an anti-capitalist action to end an issue in which the United States is exploiting class. Additionally, the ninth argument is turn we ultimately reform capitalism. Our arguments on a world in which you try to oppose capitalism, and the constant trend means that the capitalist system would just reestablish. Our arguments that the only way in which we can reform the system is by removing the bad parts of capitalism, i.e. the fact that we are allowed for nuclear testing within the future. With 10th argument turn, our discourse will ultimately allows for actually scratch that alternative. First argument is orientation due to the plan and endorse Marxist labor theory. In practice, our argument that the ace, or that this is theoretically legitimate, includes all the plan or all parts of the alternative. The ace point is that Judith Butler indicates that you have to have competing epistemologies come together to create a practice for change in the future. That is the only way we can allow for Allied cohesiveness, which is something they indicate is essential on the alternative page. But the B points the double line either A, the alternative is so strong, specifically rejection of these sort of issues that would allow for, or that would be able to overcome the class links to the plan, or that there are so many other issues of class that would ultimately derail the alternative from solving the C ways that are arguing that putting natives first is absolutely essential, specifically doing this in the context of the alternative, or the other way in which they could do this is doing the alternative alone, which would ultimately allow for the continued subjugation of natives long within the future. Of the D ways the politics of undecidability, i.e. the fact that the affirmative, that the permutation would engage two completely different ideologies and create some sort of practice in the future, allows for individuals to draw their own conclusions with the future. The second argument is no solvency arguments that the alternative bifurcates the movement arguments that the fact that you have to condemn or allow for some sort of condemnation through the alternative means that would be impossible to allow for coalition building, which means that the alternative would never be able to solve individuals just backlash. The third argument is no solvency arguments that cannot condemnation turns people against the alternative causes a short-term way in which we would ultimately become passive against the alternative, and ultimately look for some other way in which we could address these issues, or look for some other way that we would actively become capitalist, means that it would ultimately make things worse. With the fourth argument, third arguments that elites would ultimately co-opt the movement independently in a world in which you not engage with the discourse of the state, means that it's far more likely that individuals like Dick Cheney or Halliburton come in the room and ultimately squash you out. Arguments that the world, or the fifth argument is the double line either A, the alternative is so visible that is ultimately co-opted by elites because they would ultimately be seen as the threat, or the B point that the alternative is invisible or not seen as the threat, which means that nobody would ever be able to join. But the sixth argument is they do not solve the case. There's no reason why this act of condemnation ultimately means that the United States would not continue testing, because we ultimately just justify it by racial-based issues, which means that you just flip the polls. Anything else? Framework on the criticism, we're link turning, it doesn't matter. Impacts on the criticism, we're link turning, doesn't matter. Framework. Our argument that the first argument is that demanding action by the government is ultimately allows for the explicit political structures that are just employed by the government in the future, i.e. the fact that we have blood quantum laws, which are an indication that we need to have the government to support native identity, is probably the same indication that in a world in which the alternative, or the negative would like us to defend government action, probably is an indication about why you would just allow for these sort of heinous laws to continue within the future. It's only a question of creating a counter-hegemonic discourse that will be able to solve. The second argument is that fiat is just trading in colonialism, i.e. the fact that resolutions constantly ask us to increase our ballistic missile defense or engage some sort of country economically or militarily in a punitive measure is probably an indication about why this sort of fiat-centered sort of debate is ultimately bad and allows for us to ratify colonialism in the future. But the third argument is counter-interpretation arguments that we defend the affirmative to the broader context in which you read arguments that this solves for all of your offense, because there is no intrinsic reason as to why fiat is absolutely essential to your link arguments. You just have to defend your specific arguments based upon the discourse or some sort of impact calculus that would be about to justify why your impacts matter. There's no reason as to why that is ultimately bad. The next argument is that cross-apply our standards from the PMC specifically about why fiat ultimately is bad. The ace point is that allows for us to continually produce alternative forms of knowledge. The next argument is that where is this argument? Oh yes, the planned vacuum it's threats. Additionally, the next argument is that fetishizing predictability is ultimately bad. The negative says that predictability is absolutely essential. As parliamentary debate, the reason why it exists is that so that we ultimately reject predictability and ultimately have to adapt on our feet. But the next argument is that there's no reason as why ground is absolutely essential. You have not isolated key ground of the you have lost case. They say product of capitalism. I've answered this on the link term that you can group. The next three arguments that subcritical, there's no reason why we would replace subcritical tests with anything worse. Arguments that we end the testing protocol because we do not have the computer data necessary to allow for computer testing within the future. It means that the affirmative is the nail in the coffin. Additionally, you say we not solve for the last issue. Arguments that we are interrogating this with the alternative means that if we win the link term debates, we'd ultimately solve for the case arguments. And additionally, we would solve for the case independently because we are taking action to end this sort of ongoing nuclear violence. Means that a world which you're conceding multiple solvent targets, we would resolve for the city. You say no moral obligation, that is fine. We will just go for arguments for why is the root cause of continued violence on solvency. You can extend the argument for why the discourse of solidarity is absolutely essential. They just say that we'll continue to dump stuff on them. There's no reason why we would change our policy in the future. You can see multiple solvency arguments about why we create a counter-hegemonic discourse. That means that we would ultimately treat these individuals far better in the future because it means that we would actually have some sort of discourse of solidarity and allow for academic engagement, which allows for discovery, education, and actually long within the future arguments that the discourse of the affirmative is specifically essential to creating a movement that would allow individuals in the debate community to become more politically involved in this question and allow for them to probably write their congressperson or be more politically engaged.
Okay. The order will be.
You all mind if I open the door? It's a little hot here.
The order will be the framework shell.
I'm going to need a minute.
Oh. Okay. The order will be the framework shell thing. You have to defend the topical plan text or whatever. That on top. The case, just some extensions, and then the critique. I'll just signpost that. But the order will be framework. Actually, I'll say order. Order will be framework, impacts, links, alternative.
You said framework impacts and alternative.
Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going for this position. Ultimately, I think that we're going to be winning our framework arguments and the rest of the case. We don't really care about that. On to the case.
All right, so on the case, first extend the argument that an ethical stance is impossible without a...
Oh yeah, first extend the argument that an ethical stance is impossible in a world where you're operating in a bad ideology. All of your ethical considerations are meaningless because you operate in a fundamentally unethical system, i.e. you attempt to arrive at the ethical solution without understanding that capitalism is inherently unethical. In a world where you operate within the capitalist system, any outcome is ultimately going to be disadvantageous to those who are disadvantaged due to their class, such as the natives, which means that your ethics arguments are ultimately irrelevant in a world where we can establish that you are inherently capitalist and capitalism is totalizingly bad, which you certainly concede because you concede all the impacts on the criticism.
Next argument is ignoring production of discourse too.
Oh yeah, they also ignore, wait, what argument?
The capitalism is the production of discourse.
Oh yeah, they ignore the argument that capitalism controls the production of discourse, which is essentially the argument I just made, which means that not only is arriving at a fundamental or a coherent vision of ethics impossible in a world where you're operating within the capitalist framework, but all of your discourse will inherently be capitalist when you operate within a capitalist framework, which means attempting to resist without first overcoming capitalism ultimately reproduces capitalist outcomes, which means that you ultimately reproduce the impacts of the criticism. On the criticism, all right, there's no answer made to the framework. We have a few specific arguments that aren't simply exactly the same as the framework arguments they read, so these concessions are going to be problematic for them. You can consider the number 1 argument and the number 4 argument. In particular, if capitalism, they extend the argument that capitalism is the primal cause of problems with status quo. It's the most totalizing theory that explains how we arrived at where we are. It's a theory which explains how class operates, and class operations explain the rest of society. So in particular, whoever establishes the best form of dialectical materialism, this sort of historicism, that best explains capitalism is the one who solves best in a world, what?
The number 1 concession is that focus on method is key to action, otherwise...
So yeah, focus on method is key to action, which means that you have to establish whether operating within a fundamentally capitalist framework is acceptable before you can evaluate whether or not there are discursive modes of action solved on the case. What?
And everything else is located in the state, only Marxist method.
Oh yeah, they say that everything else is located within the state, only focus on labor has the ability to resist state. Everything else is ultimately co-opted by the state, by the capitalist system. Only pure focus on labor has the ability to avoid this sort of co-optation. On to the links. All right, a lot of their links can essentially be broadly grouped in one case. They sort of misidentify what our link argument is. Our link argument is not a link of omission. Our link argument is not that you simply fail to talk about class. Our link argument is that you actively misidentify the root cause and the solvency mechanisms for the situation that the natives find themselves in. And the natives find themselves in the situation that they're in because of the material reality that they live in, i.e. the state and the capitalist system will ultimately always seek to exploit those who are of a low socioeconomic class. This is the ultimate cause of their problem. By misidentifying the cause of their problem as a result of the discursive way that we identify the natives within our society and arguing that you can solve that by changing the way that we discursively act within the capitalist system, fundamentally misidentifies the problem and makes it impossible for you to solve. By misidentifying the problem, we win our framing arguments about how methodology always precedes our ability to solve, and you operate within a bad capitalist methodology where you misidentify the problem, which makes it impossible for you to overcome the bad capitalist ideology, means that you're always going to be inevitably trapped within this ideology. You can extend our specific arguments about how, like focusing on discourse, seeks political by reducing our resistance to transgression of speech acts within the system, when in fact we must undergo revolution to take back material control of our lives so that we're not ultimately always trapped by the need of the capitalist system to extract labor value from us, which is exactly what traps the natives in their situation indefinitely.
All of their turn arguments can't happen because they're co-opted by the system, because they have to operate within the state. They can't operate
they lack the ability to operate outside of capitalism, which means all their turn arguments as to why discourse ultimately has the ability to solve back for our link arguments don't make any sense because they operate within a capitalist framework. In particular, they say they identify language as the root cause of this problem. There are one to two arguments that do this. However, language is always controlled by the capitalist system. You can extend our arguments at the framework level. They say that they're able to see why we treat natives the way they do, but again, if our argument is correct and you misidentify the causes and the solvency mechanisms that can be used to liberate natives from the current situations, then no, you do not see you do not actively identify or accurately identify why natives are being treated the way they are. You misidentify the reasons why natives are being treated why they are, which ultimately makes it impossible not only for you to solve in this instance, but makes it possible to solve.
We have to start by thinking that we cannot reform.
They say we have to start by thinking that we cannot reform, but like this is exactly what the capitalist system wants us to believe. Capitalism wants us to believe that it's inevitable. It's only by assuming an infinite ability to reform the government system that we live in that we can conceptualize a world with enough class conscience to overcome capitalism. We have to believe that we have ultimate control over the class structure as the masses, as the common people, in order to be able to overcome the system. Anything else simply allows capitalism to justify itself endlessly. They say on scholarship. They say scholarship is critical because we have to be able to we'll simply be blacked out if we don't operate within the system. But first of all, that's ridiculous because it's hardly true that there aren't any radicals within academia that would be perfectly willing to do scholarship articles on radical Marxism. Like last time I checked, all the English departments in the entire country are populated by Marxists, which seems to indicate that there will be plenty of scholarship on the issue. But the next argument is that the scholarship in the status quo operates within an elite framework, which makes it impossible to overcome class consciousness, which means that if it's true that they won't, that they'll simply black us out, we're not operating within the system, that those are people that would never contribute to our movement anyway, which means it makes it impossible for us to solve if we operate with them. The next argument is that we produce no change in real politics, but again, real politics currently operates within the capitalist system. We must overcome the capitalist system as per our framework arguments before we can engage meaningfully in real politics. These framework arguments I'll go concede. I've already answered link of omission. They say we look at the intersection between race and class, but the intersection between race and class assumes that it's possible to produce equality between the different racial and ethnic groups before you produce class equality. However, class equality always has to come first, because without class equality, racial politics will always be used to divide the masses between one another in order to prevent a popular social movement to overthrow the bourgeoisie, which means that it's always impossible to have racial equality without first identifying the causes of class inequality. Another permutation. All right, first, on to permutation one. That Marxism requires you to utilize personalized classes theory, the risk of the link over long-term insolvency by diluting its vision with ideological commitments to the status quo as part of link arguments. You should be skeptical of any claim that class knowledge can only be facilitated by elite action, because we indict that all over the place. The next argument is that the permutation either links or is severance. The PMC is not just a plan where you couldn't actually vote for it. Severance perms are intellectually irresponsible and don't justify voting out. You can extend our perm preempts about severance or regeneration, which go conceded, which seems to indicate that you can't vote on a severance perm, sure.
So how are we severance if we're defending the entirety of our advocacy text?
Well, our argument is that you either sever out of the justifications of the PMC, which we say that you have to defend in our framework argument.
Is that an issue of severance, or is that an issue of just elite lead
No,
to
that
capitalism.
was
No
one
more
question.
questions.
Yeah.
On to the links. So I have the next argument. The links preclude the permutation. You can extend our regeneration argument. Capitalism can't be particularized into its instruments because it's like trying to chop the heads off a hydra without attacking the body. They merely regrow themselves in new forms, which means that capitalism will always reform itself in a world of permutation. The double bind argument doesn't make any sense because, again, we say that you can't particularize capitalism into its instruments, which means that if you attempt to do so in this instance, that you will always end up doing so in the long term. Okay. On to, they say that you bifurcate the movement. However, movement has to be totalizing as per the rest of our arguments as to how if you attempt to include other elements in the movement, they'll always inevitably be co-opted by the status quo. They say the elites don't cooperate, but the only way that we can ever solve is if elites are not included in the movement, because otherwise they will always co-opt the movement. All right. Next are the impacts. None of the impacts are answered, which means that you can extend in particular the argument, the number 4 argument that we turn the case. You can also extend the argument that unless we overcome capitalism, collapse leading to extinction is inevitable, which means that we will turn the case and lead to extinction inevitably unless we overcome capitalism.
Or this impact page on the criticism, the links, actually, yeah, impact page, framework. And then the alternative, and then the links, and then finally case by the time.
Yeah, it's over there.
It's all good.
One more time, please.
Okay, so it'll be impacts page of the criticism, framework page of the K, then alt, and then links, and then case if I have time. Everyone ready?
Yeah.
What are you doing? You cannot concede the entirety of the impacts page. It specifically says that the collapse is inevitable in the world of a system where you continue the capitalist system. That means if we have a risk of falling back to capitalism, they are unable to. That makes all of their impacts inevitable anyway, because the collapse of the capitalist system is going to lead to extinction, which is probably significantly worse for any of these groups than what they originally isolated. You're also conceding the argument that capitalism forces essentially forces the imperial drive to secure new forces of expansion. This is problematic for you. If you can't solve back to the fundamental system that's perpetuating these abuses in the first place, you can't stop them permanently. We specifically make the argument on the permutation that any form of reform is always going to be problematic because it just re-entrenches capitalist logic. You are not responsive to this argument, which means that any risk that you are still an aspect of capitalism is going to mean that you are unable to solve the capitalist system, which means that you are going to culminate in extinction and going to be unable to solve for the system as a whole. Framework. You can see the argument that the role of the ballot is to evaluate the round as a dialectical materialist. You are a historian inquiring into the best theory. You have not presented an alternative historical theory, meaning that the Marxist slavery theory values the only theory that you can evaluate as the best historical theory. You're also conceding the argument that Marxist method is necessary to move the discussion outside the state, that every other discussion is capitalist, meaning that you are necessarily located within the state because you are not adopting a Marxist ideology. Furthermore, you're conceding the argument that the debate is a critical side of resistance and that Marxist slavery theory values the best descriptive theory and can isolate every single instance. That is going to be problematic for you because that means that this is the only theory that is able to be evaluated under our framework argument. No competing framework evaluation means that you must vote for the historical theory that is best able to explain class. So that's really us. Link, alternative level. You're conceding the argument that the voting negative acts upon the ethical necessity of criticism by bringing violent practices to the front. This is problematic for you. You make a bunch of all-solvency dumps, but you are not actually responsive to the arguments that we're reading. We make the argument that condemnation is absolutely critical because you are disavowing the critical relations of power and that the act of condemnation is going to call everything into question. That means that the alternative has 100% chance of resolving our issues. Your arguments are not responsive to the way that our alternative is framed. We make the specific argument that revolutionary theory is a prior question. You are irrelevant when the entire scheme of capitalism happens. Look, they are not interrogating the capitalist system. They are making an effort to reform within that system. All of their arguments are predicated on operating within the system, even though they claim that they are operating outside the state. They are trying to reform it and then cause that and have that cause further action. They are never actually responsive to the state. They never strike a specific blow against state institutions. You can also extend the permutation and preempt argument, specifically the regeneration argument, which instantiates that only complete rejection of capitalism is ever going to be possible to solve. That means that there is no risk that the permutation has any potential to resolve the alternative, and means that the only chance to solve back capitalism in the round is the alternative. Go to the F. Actually, sorry, the links page. Your turn arguments are not responsive to the specificness of our link. We make the specific argument that discursive framing can only come after you are constructed by, in the role of a worker, right? You are defined first and foremost, not by the people you identify with, the physical traits that you have. You are defined by the class that you are placed into, the amount of wealth that you have. When you are not specifically responsive to this argument, you try to make the claim that discourse comes first. We can't even talk at the point where class is already influencing us. We are literally, from the moment of birth, put into a system where only class is the determined factor in what we can achieve. Furthermore, you are not responsive to the specific link argument that says that certain discourses are assumed to be more significant in your world, which means that you cannot actually resolve the intersectionality of discourse because you are automatically assuming that the native discourse is more prevalent or more powerful than any other discourse. All right, you're on to the app. Even in that world, you're conceding on the affirmative that you're ignoring the production of discourse and knowledge. You're also conceding the argument that you are just masking all the other bad things that we do to natives, which is going to be problematic for you because it means that you can't solve with a complete system. Furthermore, any argument on the alternative that seems to actually, I can't make that argument. And then most importantly, extend the argument that there's no moral obligation in the world of a bad ideology. That is not an answer to the MTE, which is problematic for you because it means that we first need to evaluate the shift and the ideology that we take towards looking at the world. You cannot do that without questioning capitalism because it's at the root of everything. Jesus. Devastating.
Well, why don't you just pretty much handle that thing?
So apparently there are a bunch of magazines that are inside of the podium.
Yeah.
Rough.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Alright, it's going to be their fiat thing. The defend topical plain text position. Their alternative, their impacts, their framework. I'll do case in order because that seems to be the trend. Links on the bottom. Maybe here, lots of time.
Okay. So, our framework has is links.
Well, the reason you're voting for us is because they're ignoring the lines of racism and class with their generic K with unaltered links inside of the round, whereas the alternative permutation allows us to actually look at the intersection of these lines and solve that. Go to the fiat position. I just want you to extend Ben's first argument specifically says whenever they try to demand an action out of us, it means that they continue to support the government, which becomes a link to the criticism. The impact of this means that they continue to justify cultural genocide and all violence that happens on indigenous people. This means that you automatically vote them down because it allows the current violence to continue happening on the alternative.
Kicking it doesn't resolve.
Oh yeah, kicking it doesn't resolve the link, sorry. We're going with the permutation. Our way to extend the permutation. Our argument is that we can say that nuclear racism is bad, and we can also say that capitalism is bad. The first argument they make is they say that the risk of the link is overwhelming. They're not giving unity analysis other than saying that small parts of capitalism are bad. Our argument is that we're able to break away from those small parts of capitalism because it's key to the intersections that happen. Specifically, that's Ben's analysis whenever he's telling you it's key to us to understand the amount of racism that happens inside of class systems. Otherwise, capitalism goes away and racism is left behind. You only the second argument here is they say that it leads to a form of severance. Our argument is it isn't severance because we defend the entirety of nuclear racism being bad.
We defend the entirety of the plan.
Yeah, and the entirety of the plan. We defend all of it.
Yeah.
I want you to extend next becomes advantages of the permutation. You can extend C point specifically that we allow natives to come first. Our argument is that whenever this happens, it means that we can specifically look to the type of analysis that happens. You can also extend the A point that competing epistemologies allows us to come to a better form of solvency because we can interrogate how that functions. And you can also extend the analysis of the politics of indecidability that specifically says that we don't force you to make a decision, which means that we don't push individuals out, which bifurcates the movement. Disadd the alternative. You can extend the Ben's second argument specifically no solvency because they do bifurcate
They
the
say
movement.
Hydra. Answer the Hydra argument.
I did. That's the answer to small parts of capitalism. That was the answer to the Hydra argument. You can also extend Ben's second argument specifically says no solvency because they bifurcate the movement. This means that there's no way that they can build any coalitions because they push individuals out. The only way they can build coalitions is with the competing with the politics of indecidability, which means that the only way you'd ever be able to get any form of solvency back is with the permutation. Whenever they don't answer this argument, it means that they don't solve anything. It means all that they have left is the status quo versus the plan. No way they can win. Impacts. Their argument is, what are you doing? My argument is, we're league turning. Next page. Framework. You can extend, our first argument is that link turns means that we went back. If it's true, also you can extend, also they make the argument that they're focused on dialogue. Argument is if it's true that it's focused on dialogue, then the intersections of this dialogue are key on the framework. They say that the affirmative use is unethical system, which means we'll never be able to solve back. I can extend its analysis that if we want link turns, it means that we're not using an unethical system because it allows us to have the collapse. It allows us to have the collapse of capitalism.
This is on case.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is the first on our case. Sorry. The first argument is that the affirmative use is an unethical system, which means that we can't solve. You can extend its analysis that if we have the link turns, means we can break away capitalism, which means that we go into an ethical system. Also, the second argument that they make here is they say that capitalism controls the direction of discourse. Our analysis is all about the way the counter-hegemonic discourse happens, which means that all of this analysis...
There's absolutely no response to the argument that discourse is shaped by capitalism, that you're ignoring the production of discourse.
I've not made an argument yet.
Okay.
It's responsive to that argument.
You don't even know what I'm saying.
I'm not many debate, man.
Thank you. All that capitalism controls the direction of discourse, and all of this all happens on the alternative. This is all the argumentation that happens about what counter-hegemonic discourse means. Specifically, we'll address it there. That's all they extend. That's all they extend. This is Ben's last argument. I want you to extend that they're conceding the solvency, which specifically says that counter-hegemonic discourse is key to the movement, to the debate community, because it allows us to come with you. It's funny that you say we don't address it, but this is Ben's last argument, specifically saying that this is the only way we can get any form of solvency. This means that you can see this analysis, which means that because you don't use discourse, you never get an escape. Go to the links. They're trying to argue about misidentification. They get to pull this out and start talking about it later on. Our analysis becomes pretty easy because we say that, first of all, if we win a link term, misidentification doesn't matter because we still fix it. Also, since we're already winning that they don't get solvency to the alternative, this also doesn't matter. The rest of this analysis I'm about to give you becomes defense, but we've already won the debate around. First argument to misidentification is they're not giving you any impact to misidentification other than saying that we don't talk about the root cause. It doesn't matter if we win the link turns and solve it back. The second argument is that we do identify it. You can extend bins number 3 and number 7. Bins number 3 specifically says link turn. We expose why they treat individuals as inferior overall. And number 7 is that the only affirmative exposes the intersections of race and class, which specifically talks about how the capitalistic structure happens. Also, you can extend bins number 3, which is the number, extend bins number 6, which specifically said the links of omission are bad because they don't generate any type of offense. This is ultimately just an extension of their link of omission, which means that they don't get access to it anyway. The second argument is they say that they only want to create a revolution. Our argument is that we're calling it the debate community that is revolutionary. The third argument is they say that we can't act outside of capitalism, except they're conceding link turns 1, 3, and 4. The fourth one is specifically that critical epistemology is key because the affirmative is the breaking point in the way the knowledge production happens, which means that we ultimately solve back for all of the affirmative. The only other answer they're making is talking about scholarship and how radicals produce elitist knowledge. Our argument is that the education allows us to break out of the classroom, calling you to join us. Specifically, we say that scholarship increases the dialogue to break away. None of this matters whenever we already win the link turns and the alternative solves. Really easy vote for us.